Christmas Eve had always been my favorite night of the year. Ever since I was a little girl growing up in Boston, I'd cherished those magical evenings when the world seemed to pause and breathe in the spirit of love and togetherness. Now, at 68, I still felt that same childlike excitement as I prepared our family dinner at my modest two-bedroom apartment on Marlborough Street. The day had been a flurry of activity. I'd woken at dawn, mentally checking my list of preparations while watching the soft December snow drift past my kitchen window. The turkey was already thawing in the refrigerator, a beautiful 15-pounder I'd splurged on at Wilson's Market. My husband Tom would have approved of the extravagance. "For family, Margaret," he would have said with that warm smile I still missed every day, 5 years after his passing. By noon, the apartment was filled with the comforting scent of baking. My traditional cranberry bread, Tom's favorite sweet potato casserole, and fresh rolls were cooling on every available surface. I'd pushed my furniture against the walls to make room for the fold-out table that would seat all 7 of us, my son Robert, his wife Diane, their daughter Emma, my sister Janet, her husband Phil, and their son Michael. I hummed "Silent Night" as I carefully arranged the table with the good china that Tom and I had received as wedding gifts 40 years ago. The pieces had tiny chips here and there, but they carried our history in every imperfection. The red and gold decorations I'd purchased from Baker's Home Goods brightened the room, and I'd splurged on real candles this year instead of the battery-operated ones Robert always insisted were safer. When everything was ready, I stepped back to admire my work. The table looked like something from a Martha Stewart magazine, not bad for a retired high school English teacher living on a modest pension. The apartment might be small, but tonight it felt like a palace. The doorbell rang at exactly 6 o'clock. Robert was always punctual, one of the few traits he'd inherited from his father. He stood in the hallway, tall and handsome in his navy blue sweater, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Merry Christmas, Mom," he said, leaning down to kiss my cheek. His cologne smelled expensive, something new and unfamiliar. Diane followed behind him, elegant as always in a red cashmere dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, not a strand out of place. She air-kissed both my cheeks, a habit she'd picked up after her promotion at the investment firm where she worked. "Margaret, the place looks lovely," she said, her eyes quickly scanning my apartment with what felt like assessment rather than appreciation. "We brought wine. It's a Bordeaux, quite exclusive." 8-year-old Emma bounded in last, immediately wrapping her arms around my waist. "Grandma, it smells amazing in here." My heart warmed as I hugged her back. Emma was my joy, the bright spot in what had become an increasingly complicated relationship with my son and his wife. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart. Want to help me put the finishing touches on the table?" Janet and her family arrived shortly, after bringing more warmth into the apartment. My sister had always been my rock, especially after Tom died. While we arranged the food on the table, she whispered, "You've outdone yourself, Maggie. Tom would be proud." As we all settled around the table, I couldn't help but notice how Robert and Diane sat slightly apart from me, their conversation directed mostly toward Janet and Phil. They'd been acting strange for months now, phone calls that ended abruptly. When I entered the room, sudden weekend trips they were vague about, and an odd reluctance to invite me to their home in Cambridge. I tried to push away my concerns. Maybe I was just being sensitive. After all, they were busy with their careers and raising Emma. Robert's law practice was thriving, and Diane had recently been promoted to senior investment advisor. They didn't have time to constantly check in on their aging mother. I understood. That, even if it stung. The dinner began pleasantly enough. We passed dishes around, complimented the food, and shared safe topics of conversation. The unusually heavy snowfall Boston had received this year, Michael's college applications, Phil's recent retirement from teaching at Boston College. I watched as Diane poured herself a second glass of wine, noticing how she barely touched the food I'd spent all day preparing. Robert seemed distracted, checking his phone under the table when he thought no one was looking. Every few minutes, they would exchange glances that seemed loaded with meaning. Emma, bless her heart, filled the awkward silences with stories about her school play and the letter she'd written to Santa. She sat beside me, occasionally leaning against my arm in a way that made my heart swell. "Grandma, can I have more cranberry sauce? Yours is way better than the one Mom buys from the store." Diane's smile tightened at Emma's innocent comment. "Well, some of us don't have all day to cook, sweetie. That's why Whole Foods exists." The subtle dig wasn't lost on me, but I let it slide. This was Christmas Eve, and I wasn't going to let petty comments ruin our family time. As the meal progressed, I felt a growing tension in the room. Janet tried to maintain the conversation, asking Robert about his recent business trip to New York, but his answers were short and evasive. Diane kept glancing at her watch, as if she had somewhere better to be. "Is everything all right?" I finally asked, unable to ignore the strain any longer. "You both seem a bit preoccupied tonight." "Everything's fine, Mom," Robert said quickly. "Just tired from work. It's been a busy month." Diane nodded in agreement, but her eyes didn't meet mine. The end of the year is always hectic in finance. Tax planning, portfolio adjustments. You know how it is. I didn't know, actually. My financial knowledge extended to balancing my checkbook and making sure my teacher's pension covered my monthly expenses. Tom had always handled our investments, and after he passed, Robert had insisted on taking over that responsibility. "It's too complicated for you to worry about, Mom," he'd said. At the time, I'd been grateful for his help during my grief. Now, watching them exchange another furtive glance, I wondered if I'd been too trusting. "More turkey, anyone?" I offered, trying to recapture the festive spirit. The conversation resumed, but the undercurrent of tension remained. I caught Diane whispering something to Robert, her expression serious. He nodded subtly, then quickly smiled when he noticed me watching. I took a sip of water, trying to calm the unease growing in my stomach. This was my family, my son whom I'd raised with all the love in my heart. Whatever was happening, I was surely misreading the situation. Little did I know that in just a few minutes, my world would shift on its axis, and this Christmas Eve, my favorite night of the year, would become the beginning of a painful awakening. The dinner continued, with forced pleasantries as I brought out the apple pie I'd baked that morning. Emma clapped her hands in delight. She'd always loved my pies, especially the little pastry leaves I arranged on top. As I sliced generous portions for everyone, Emma swung her legs beneath her chair, her holiday dress sparkling under the warm glow of the candles. "Grandma makes the best pies in the whole world," she announced, plunging her fork into the flaky crust. "It's wonderful, Margaret," Janet agreed, her kind eyes meeting mine across the table. "No one can compete with your baking." I felt a small flush of pride as I watched my family enjoy the dessert. Even Diane took a bite, though she quickly set her fork down afterward, probably counting calories again. Robert seemed to relax a bit, the tension in his shoulders easing as he savored the familiar taste of childhood. For a moment, it felt like old times, before Tom's passing, before the subtle distance had grown between my son and me. The conversation flowed more naturally now, centered around safer topics like the Christmas lights on Commonwealth Avenue and the charity drive at Janet's church. That's when it happened. Emma, having finished her pie in record time, turned to me with innocent curiosity shining in her eyes. "Grandma, are you enjoying the country house that Daddy gave you? Is it pretty with all the snow?" The question hung in the air like a suspended moment in time. I felt my fork freeze halfway to my mouth, confusion clouding my thoughts. Country house? What country house? Around the table, everything seemed to stop. Janet's eyebrows rose in surprise. Phil's chewing slowed to a halt. But most telling was the reaction from my son and his wife. Diane choked on her wine, her face flushing crimson as she grabbed her napkin and pressed it to her mouth. Robert's expression shifted from relaxation to alarm in an instant. His eyes, darting to his wife, then to me, then to his daughter. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" I asked Emma gently, setting my fork down on my plate with deliberate care. "I don't have a country house. I live right here in this apartment on Marlborough Street." Emma's face scrunched in confusion. "But Daddy and Mommy said they gave you—" "Grandpa's house in Vermont, the one with the big fireplace where we go skiing." She looked to her parents for confirmation. "Remember? You said it was Grandma's house now, but she lets us use it." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the old radiator in the corner hissing, the distant sound of carolers on the street below, the tick of the antique clock Tom had given me on our 25th anniversary. Diane recovered first, her smile tight and forced. "Emma, honey, you've misunderstood. That's not what we said at all." Her voice had a sharp edge that made Emma shrink back in her chair. "But," Emma began. "Emma," Robert cut in, his tone firm. "That's enough. You're confused about what you heard." I took a slow sip of water, studying my son's face over the rim of my glass. In 38 years, I'd learned to read every expression, every twitch of his features. Right now, he wasn't just uncomfortable. He was hiding something significant. "What house in Vermont?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. "Tom and I never owned property in Vermont." Robert cleared his throat. "It's nothing, Mom. Emma's confused. We rented a place near Stowe for a few weekends this year, that's all." But his explanation didn't match the panic in Diane's eyes or the certainty in Emma's voice. My granddaughter might be young, but she wasn't prone to making things up. "We went there for Thanksgiving," Emma continued, oblivious to the tension. "It has a big kitchen and a room with blue wallpaper that Mommy says will be mine when I'm older." Janet and Phil exchanged uncomfortable glances. My sister knew me well enough to sense that something was very wrong. "Robert," Janet said carefully, "is there something Margaret should know about?" My son's jaw tightened. "This isn't the time or place for this discussion." "I think it's exactly the time and place," I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice, despite the turmoil building inside me. "If there's a house in Vermont that supposedly belongs to me, I'd like to know about it." Diane set her napkin down with precise movements. "It's a complicated financial arrangement, Margaret. Nothing for you to worry about. Robert has been managing your affairs, just as Tom wanted." Her condescending tone sent a chill through me. My affairs? As if I were incapable of understanding my own finances? "Tom left me his life insurance and our savings," I said. "There was no house in Vermont." The room grew unbearably tense. Emma looked between the adults, sensing the discord she'd unwittingly created. "It was part of Tom's investment portfolio," Robert finally said, his voice low. "Some property shares that matured after his death. I've been managing them for you." Knew he was lying. Tom had been meticulous about our finances, explaining everything to me in detail. He would never have hidden property investments, especially not something as significant as a house. "Is this true, Robert?" I asked, looking directly into my son's eyes, the same deep blue as his father's. "Did you use my inheritance to buy a house in Vermont without telling me?" Robert's face hardened. "Mom, you don't understand how these things work. Dad left instructions for me to manage your assets responsibly. That's exactly what I've done." "By purchasing a vacation home that I didn't know existed? A home that apparently you and your family use regularly?" Diane interjected, her voice sharp. "We've made improvements to the property. It's an investment that's appreciating in value. You should be thanking Robert for his financial acumen." Janet placed her hand on mine under the table, a silent gesture of support. She'd never particularly warmed to Diane, finding her materialistic and cold. "I think," Phil said, speaking for the first time since the revelation, "that Margaret deserves the full story. If there's property in her name—" "It's not exactly in her name," Diane interrupted. "The ownership structure is complex. It's held in a family trust that Robert administers." A family trust? This was the first I'd heard of it. The betrayal, cut deep, made worse by the realization that they'd been enjoying this hidden property while I struggled to make ends meet in my rented apartment. "Emma," Janet said gently, "why don't you come help me wash these dessert plates? I bet there are some Christmas cookies in Grandma's kitchen we could find." My sister tactfully removed my granddaughter from the increasingly tense conversation. Emma followed reluctantly, sensing she'd said something important, but not understanding the implications. When they'd left the dining room, I folded my hands on the table and looked between my son and his wife. "I want to know everything, now." Robert sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his father that it made my heart ache. "Mom, after Dad died, you were in no condition to handle complex financial decisions. The insurance payout and his investments needed professional management. So you took control without consulting me?" "I protected your interests," he insisted. "The market was volatile. I made decisions that secured your future." "By buying a vacation home for yourself?" Diane's patience visibly snapped. "It's not just for us. It's an investment property that's doubled in value since purchase. The trust is structured to benefit all of us, including you." "How exactly has it benefited me?" I asked, my voice growing stronger, with righteous anger. "I'm living on a teacher's pension in a rented apartment while you enjoy a house in Vermont that was purchased with my husband's insurance money?" Robert at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "We've been planning to explain everything to you when the time was right." "And when would that be?" I challenged. "When I'm too old to question you? When I'm dependent enough to accept whatever crumbs you decide to throw my way?" Phil, always the diplomat, tried to ease the tension. "Perhaps we should all take a step back. It's Christmas Eve after all." But the festive spirit had been irreparably damaged. The truth had been lurking beneath the surface of our family gatherings for months, maybe years, and now it was exposed in all its ugly reality. "I want to see the paperwork," I said firmly. "All of it. The trust documents, the property deed, the account statements, everything." "Mom, be reasonable," Robert pleaded. "This isn't something we need to address tonight." "I think it's exactly what we need to address," I countered. "How long have you been hiding this from me? What else don't I know about my own finances?" The look that passed between Robert and Diane confirmed my worst fears. There was more, much more, that they weren't telling me. Janet returned with Emma, who clutched a Christmas cookie in her small hand. She looked uncertain, aware that she'd somehow caused a disruption, but not understanding how. "Is everything okay?" she asked in a small voice. I summoned a smile from my granddaughter. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Grown-ups just need to sort out some boring money stuff." But as I looked at my son, the little boy I'd raised with such love and hope, I knew that nothing was fine. Something fundamental had broken between us tonight, revealed by an innocent child's question. And I was determined to discover exactly how deep the deception went. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and stilted conversation. Janet and Phil left shortly after our confrontation, my sister squeezing my hand and whispering, "Call me tomorrow," as they departed. Robert and Diane made excuses about Emma needing to get to bed before Santa came, though I could see in my granddaughter's confused eyes that she sensed the tension hanging in the air. "I'm sorry if I said something wrong, Grandma," Emma murmured, as she hugged me goodbye, her small arms tight around my neck. "You didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart," I assured her, kissing her forehead. "Sometimes adults just need to talk about complicated things." Robert could barely meet my eyes as they left, promising vaguely that we would sort everything out after the holidays. Diane's parting smile was brittle, her goodbye clipped. When the door closed behind them, the silence in my apartment was deafening. The festive dinner table, with its half-eaten desserts and scattered napkins, seemed to mock the family gathering I'd so carefully planned. I mechanically cleared the dishes, my mind racing as I pieced together fragments of conversations, unexplained absences, and subtle changes in my son's behavior over the past few years. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay awake in the darkness, my thoughts churning with questions and suspicions. The gentle snow falling outside my window, which had seemed so magical earlier, now felt like a cold shroud over my trust and security. By morning, grief had hardened into resolve. I wasn't going to wait for Robert to decide when to sort things out. I'd spent too many years as a high school English teacher not to recognize when someone was stalling or fabricating a story. If my son wouldn't voluntarily provide answers, I would find them myself. The day after Christmas, while most of Boston was still enjoying holiday leftovers and new gifts, I made my way to the Suffolk County Registry of Deeds. The building was nearly empty, which suited me perfectly. At the information desk, I met Harriet, a gray-haired clerk who'd been working there for 30 years. "Property records?" she repeated after I explained my request. "Do you have the address?" "No," I admitted, "but it would be somewhere in Vermont. Purchased within the last 5 years, possibly under the name Robert Caldwell or Margaret Caldwell." I hesitated, then added, "or possibly under something called a family trust." Harriet's eyes softened with understanding. Something in my expression must have conveyed the urgency of my quest. "Vermont properties wouldn't be registered here in Suffolk County," she explained gently. "But I can show you how to search for trusts or entities registered in Massachusetts that might be connected to property elsewhere." For the next hour, Harriet guided me through databases and records. We found nothing under my name, but under Robert's, we discovered the Caldwell Family Trust, established 3 years ago, just 6 months after Tom's death. "It lists you as a beneficiary," Harriet noted, pointing to my name on the document. "But your son is the sole trustee with full discretionary powers." My heart sank as I read the legal language, dense with terms I didn't fully understand. What I did comprehend was that Robert had complete control over the trust assets that rightfully should have been mine to manage. "What does this mean in practical terms?" I asked Harriet. She removed her reading glasses, choosing her words carefully. "It means that while you're technically a beneficiary, you don't have any direct control over the assets in the trust. The trustee, your son, decides how the assets are invested and distributed." "So he could use the money for anything, even if it doesn't benefit me?" "Within certain fiduciary limitations, yes," she confirmed. "The trust gives him significant latitude." I thanked Harriet for her help and left with copies of the trust documents. Outside, the winter air bit at my cheeks, but I barely noticed. The cold. My mind was too occupied with the betrayal unfolding before me. Over the next week, I became an amateur detective in my own life story. I called Tom's old colleague from the insurance company, Paul Reynolds, who had helped with our financial planning for years. "Margaret," Paul said when I reached him at his Florida retirement home, "I've been meaning to call you. How are things going with that property in Stowe? Robert mentioned you were all enjoying it." My grip tightened on the phone. "Actually, Paul, that's why I'm calling. I'm trying to piece together exactly what happened. With Tom's insurance money and our investments after he passed." The long pause on the other end of the line spoke volumes. "You don't know about the property distributions?" I'm afraid not, I said, keeping my voice steady. Could you tell me what you know? Paul's discomfort was palpable, even through the phone. Margaret, Tom left specific instructions that you were to be taken care of. The policy paid out $450,000 after his death, and there were additional investments worth about $200,000. All of that was meant for your security. And what did Robert tell you about how that money was being used? Another uncomfortable pause. He said you decided to invest in a vacation property that could generate rental income. He asked for my advice on the location. I assumed you were fully involved in the decision. The pieces were falling into place, each one more painful than the last. When was the property purchased? About 2.5 years ago. Robert found a beautiful place in Stowe, 4 bedrooms, 3 acres of land. He got it for $620,000, which was actually below market value, said it needed some renovations, but had excellent potential. $620,000. Nearly all of Tom's insurance money and our joint savings spent on a luxury vacation home I'd never seen or approved. After thanking Paul and ending the call, I sat in stunned silence at my kitchen table. Outside, Boston had fallen under another blanket of snow, the city quiet in the week between Christmas and New Year's. The apartment that had felt so festive just days ago now seemed to close in around me, a reminder of how I'd been living while my inheritance funded a life of comfort for my son and his wife. The next day, I visited the bank where Tom and I had kept our accounts for decades. Martha Wilson, the branch manager, had known us for years. Of course I remember when the accounts were closed, she said after I explained my situation. I was surprised at the time, but Robert had the proper authorization. He said you were consolidating everything into a family trust for tax purposes. Did he happen to mention where the money was going? Martha hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. He said something about investment properties and securing your future. I assumed you were involved in the decisions. Everyone had assumed I was involved. Everyone except my son and daughter-in-law, who had deliberately kept me in the dark. That evening, Janet came over with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine. I spread my findings across the coffee table, the trust documents, my notes from conversations with Paul and Martha, printouts of property listings in Stowe that matched the description Paul had given me. I can't believe Robert would do this, Janet said, examining the papers with growing concern. This isn't just poor judgment, Maggie. This is, well, it's borderline elder abuse. I winced at the term. I'm not elderly and infirm, Janet. I'm 68 and perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. That's exactly my point, she replied, pouring us each a glass of wine. They had no right to take control of your money without your knowledge or consent. Have you confronted Robert yet? I shook my head. Not directly. I wanted to have all the facts first. And what are you going to do now that you have them? It was the question I'd been asking myself for days. What was the appropriate response to such a profound betrayal? Legal action seemed extreme. Robert was still my son, and I couldn't bear the thought of courtrooms and public accusations. But I couldn't simply let this pass either. I'm not sure yet, I admitted, but I know I need to see this house. I need to understand exactly what they've done with Tom's money, with my money. Janet nodded, determination flashing in her eyes. Then we'll go to Vermont. Phil and I will drive you up this weekend. 2 days later, we were heading north on I-93, the Massachusetts landscape giving way to the snow-covered mountains of New Hampshire and then Vermont. Phil drove steadily through the winter conditions, while Janet and I sat in companionable silence, each lost in our thoughts. The address I'd tracked down led us to a winding road outside Stowe, where large, well-spaced homes peeked through snow-laden pine trees. When Phil finally turned into a long driveway marked with the number 127, my breath caught in my throat. The house was stunning, a modern take on a traditional Vermont lodge with expansive windows and a wraparound porch. Even covered in snow, I could see the careful landscaping, the quality of construction. This wasn't just a vacation home, it was a showpiece. "Are you sure this is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Janet checked the address again. "This is definitely the place." We parked and approached the house cautiously, feeling like trespassers, despite my technical status as a beneficiary of the trust that owned it. Through the windows, I could see high-end furniture, a massive stone fireplace, and what looked like original artwork on the walls. "There's a security system," Phil noted, pointing to a keypad by the front door. "We can't go in without the code." I stood on the porch, overwhelmed by the tangible evidence of my son's deception. This beautiful home represented not just the money that should have secured my retirement, but the extent to which Robert and Diane had prioritized their comfort over my security. A neighbor walking his dog stopped to look at us curiously. "Are you friends of the Caldwells?" he called out. Before I could answer, Janet stepped forward. "Yes, we're family. Margaret here is Robert's mother." The man's face brightened. "Oh, you must be the famous Margaret. I've heard so much about you from Diane. They're always saying how generous you were to let them use this place. They're not here this weekend. They usually just come up for holiday weekends and sometime in the summer." Each word was another knife twist. They'd not only taken my money, but had created a fiction where I was the generous benefactor, allowing them to use my house. "Yes, that's me," I managed to say. "Just thought I'd come see the place since I haven't been up in a while." "Well, it's a beauty," the man continued, oblivious to my distress. "One of the nicest properties on this road. I understand they're planning to add a pool this spring." A pool. With my money. As we drove back to Boston that evening, a cold resolve settled in my heart. The hurt and betrayal were still there, burning beneath the surface, but they were now tempered by something stronger: determination. "What will you do?" Janet asked as the Vermont mountains receded in our rearview mirror. I gazed out at the darkening landscape, my reflection faint. In the window glass, the woman looking back at me seemed different somehow, harder, more focused. "I'm going to take back what's mine," I said quietly. "Not with lawyers or accusations, but in my own way. They think they've been so clever, building their perfect life with my husband's legacy. But they've made one critical mistake." "What's that?" Phil asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "They underestimated me." My voice was soft, but carried an edge I'd never heard in it before. "They forgot that I spent 40 years teaching teenagers to respect the truth. I know when I'm being lied to, and I know how to correct bad behavior." As we crossed back into Massachusetts, I began to formulate my plan. Robert and Diane had taken my inheritance and created their dream getaway. Now I would show them exactly what happens when you betray the wrong person, quietly, methodically, and with perfect justice. The first week of January brought a fresh blanket of snow to Boston and a renewed sense of purpose to my life. While most people were setting New Year's resolutions about weight loss or career goals, I was crafting a strategy that would teach my son and daughter-in-law the consequences of their betrayal. I began by playing the role they expected of me, the somewhat forgetful, easily confused mother who needed their guidance. When Robert finally called 3 days after New Year's, I acted as if our Christmas Eve confrontation had been a minor misunderstanding. "I've been thinking about what Emma said," I told him, keeping my voice light and slightly uncertain. "I'm sure I just misunderstood something about the finances. You know how confused I get with all that legal terminology." The relief in Robert's voice was palpable. "That's exactly it, Mom. The trust is complicated, but it's all set up for your benefit. I've been meaning to explain it properly." "I'd appreciate that, dear. Maybe you could bring some of the paperwork next time you visit. I'd feel better understanding where things stand." Of course, he agreed quickly. How about Sunday, Diane's? Taking Emma to a birthday party, so it would just be us. Perfect. Diane's absence would make this first phase easier. When Sunday arrived, Robert came bearing a folder of neatly organized documents, his lawyer's briefcase in hand. He spent an hour walking me through a sanitized version of the trust arrangement, explaining how my name was on the documentation as a beneficiary, how the Vermont property was an investment vehicle, and how it was all part of a comprehensive wealth management strategy that would ultimately benefit me. I nodded in all the right places, asked appropriately naive questions, and watched as he gradually relaxed into the belief that I was accepting his explanation at face value. So, you see, Mom, the property is technically held by the trust, but you're a primary beneficiary. It's just managed more efficiently this way, with less tax burden. I smiled, the picture of a mother pleased by her son's financial acumen. It sounds like you've thought of everything, Robert. I'm lucky to have you looking after me. The guilt flashed briefly across his face before he suppressed it. It's what Dad would have wanted. No, I thought silently, it absolutely isn't what Tom would have wanted. But I kept that truth hidden behind my accommodating smile. I'd love to see this house sometime, I said casually as he was preparing to leave. It sounds lovely. Robert hesitated for just a moment. Of course. Maybe in the spring when the roads are better. Vermont winters can be treacherous. That would be wonderful, I agreed, knowing I had no intention of waiting until spring. As soon as Robert's car pulled away from the curb, I retrieved the notes I'd hidden in my bedroom. During his explanation, I'd mentally cataloged every inconsistency, every half-truth, every crucial detail he'd conveniently omitted. Most importantly, I'd spotted the name of the property management company on one of the statements he'd shown me, Green Mountain Properties, based in Stowe. The following Tuesday, I took the bus to the downtown branch of my bank and opened a new account in my name only. I then withdrew the modest savings I'd accumulated from my teacher's pension, just over $8,000, and deposited it in the new account. It wasn't much, but it would fund the first phase of my plan. Next, I called Janet. I need a favor, I explained. Can you drive me to Vermont again this weekend? And can I stay with you for a few days after that? I might need to make a few more trips up there in the coming weeks. Of course, Janet replied without hesitation. But what are you planning, Maggie? Justice, I said simply. Nothing more, nothing less. That Saturday, Janet drove me back to Stowe. This time, instead of just observing the house from outside, we headed into town to the offices of Green Mountain Properties. The receptionist, a young woman named Kelsey with bright red hair and a friendly smile, greeted us warmly. I'm interested in seasonal rentals in the area, I explained, particularly larger homes that could accommodate family gatherings. Kelsey brightened. We manage several properties that would be perfect for that. Are you looking for something this winter season or planning ahead for summer? Actually, I'm interested in both. My sister and I are considering investing in a property ourselves, so we'd like to see what's currently on the market as well as learn about the rental potential. For the next hour, Kelsey showed us listings and rental statistics. I listened, attentively, asking questions about peak seasons, maintenance costs, and property management fees. Then, casually, I mentioned the address of Robert's house. That's a beautiful area. I believe I saw a home on that road when I was driving around yesterday. 127 Pine Hollow Road? Is that one of your properties? Kelsey checked her computer. Yes, that's the Caldwell property. It's one of our newer listings, but it's not currently on the market. The owners use it occasionally but rent it out during prime weeks. It looked lovely from the outside, I commented, similar to what we might be interested in purchasing. It's a gorgeous property, Kelsey agreed. 4 bedrooms, high-end. Finishes? Great views. The owners just completed some renovations last fall. Would you like me to show you something comparable? Actually, I said, leaning forward slightly, I'd love to see that specific property, if possible, just to get a sense of what we might be looking for. Kelsey hesitated. The Caldwells usually only rent it out for full weeks during ski season or summer. They're quite particular about the booking schedule. I smiled, channeling Diane's air of entitled confidence. I understand completely, but we're considering a similar investment, possibly even on the same road. I'd be willing to pay the full week's rate just to view it for an hour or two. Janet shot me a questioning look, but I subtly shook my head, silently asking her to trust me. After a moment's consideration, Kelsey nodded. Let me make a call to our property manager. He might be able to arrange a showing if the house is vacant right now. She stepped away to make the call, and Janet leaned over to whisper, What are you doing? You can't afford a week's rental at a place like that. I'm not actually going to rent it, I whispered back. I just need information and access. Kelsey returned with good news. You're in luck. The property is unoccupied until next weekend when the owners are coming up. Our manager, Steve, can show you the place tomorrow at 10 a.m. if that works for you. Perfect, I replied, feeling a small thrill of victory. The next morning, Steve met us at the house. He was a rugged man in his 50s with a weathered face that spoke of years spent in the Vermont mountains. As he unlocked the door, I steeled myself for what I might find inside. The interior was even more impressive than I'd imagined. Vaulted ceilings with exposed beams, a stone fireplace that dominated the great room, a gourmet kitchen with high-end appliances, and floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the mountain views. Every inch of the house spoke of luxury and comfort. Luxury purchased with my husband's life insurance money. The owners have excellent taste, Steve commented as he led us through the home. They renovated the kitchen last year and just finished updating all the bathrooms. The property rents for $4,500 a week during prime ski season, more for holiday weeks. I nodded, taking mental notes of everything I saw. Family photos of Robert, Diane, and Emma decorated the mantel, a happy family enjoying their stolen retreat. In the master bedroom, I recognized Diane's expensive taste in the designer bedding and carefully curated artwork. Does the house stay rented most of the season? I asked casually. Not as much as it could, Steve replied. The owners block off a lot of dates for personal use, even though they only come up about once a month. If they were willing to rent it more consistently, they could easily gross over $100,000 a year. The figure hung in the air. $100,000 in potential annual income from a property purchased with my money, money that should have been supporting me. What about the neighborhood? Janet asked, following my lead. Are most of these homes owner-occupied or rentals? It's a mix, Steve explained. About half are second homes that get used mainly on weekends and holidays. The others are investment properties that stay rented most of the year. This road is particularly desirable because of the mountain views and privacy. As we completed the tour, I asked for Steve's business card. I'm very impressed with this property. Would you be open to managing something similar if we decide to invest in the area? Absolutely, he said, handing me his card. I manage several properties in this price range. It's a solid investment if you can afford the initial purchase. Back in the car, Janet turned to me with a quizzical expression. Okay, now will you tell me what you're planning? I stared out at the snow-covered landscape, the skeleton of a plan taking firmer shape in my mind. I need to make one more stop before we head back to Boston. That stop was at the office of a real estate attorney named Elaine Winters, whose name I'd found through online research before our trip. I'd made an appointment for a brief consultation, telling Janet I needed to wait in the car. Inside the warmly lit office, I explained my situation to Elaine. The trust, the house purchased without my knowledge, the money that should have been mine. Legally, this is complicated, Elaine said after listening carefully. As a beneficiary of the trust, you have certain rights, but your son as trustee has significant discretion in how the assets are managed. Challenging the trust would mean going to court, which could be expensive and messy. I'm not interested in a court battle, I assured her. I just want to understand my options regarding the property specifically. Elaine thought for a moment. The interesting thing is that you're listed as a beneficiary. That gives you certain rights to benefit from the trust assets, even if you don't control them directly. There might be a way to assert those rights without dismantling the entire trust structure. Such as? I prompted. Well, she said, slowly. If the property is held for your benefit, you could potentially claim the right to use it or benefit from its income, especially if you can demonstrate that the current arrangement isn't actually serving your interests as a beneficiary. That was exactly what I needed to hear. As I left Elaine's office with a folder of legal information and her business card, the final pieces of my plan began to fall into place. On the drive back to Boston, I made a list of next steps. I would need to return to Stowe at least once more. I would need to contact Steve directly without Robert or Diane knowing. And I would need to continue playing the role of the compliant, slightly confused mother who accepted their explanations, without question. Janet, I said as we crossed the Massachusetts border, I think I'm going to need your spare bedroom for a little longer than I thought. What I'm planning will take some time. My sister glanced at me, concern and curiosity mingling in her expression. Whatever you need, Maggie, but promise me you won't do anything reckless. I smiled, feeling a spark of the determination that had made me an effective teacher for 4 decades. Not reckless, Janet, strategic. Robert and Diane thought they could take advantage of me because I'm just a naive old woman who doesn't understand finance. They're about to discover how wrong they were. As the Boston skyline appeared in the distance, I felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time since Tom's death, I wasn't simply reacting to circumstances beyond my control. I was taking charge of my future, and in the process, teaching my son and his wife a lesson they would never forget. February arrived with biting winds and record snowfall in Boston. While the city struggled under winter's grip, I methodically laid the groundwork for my plan. I'd moved temporarily into Janet's guest room in Brookline, telling Robert I was having some plumbing issues in my apartment that required extensive repairs. You could stay with us, he'd offered during one of our weekly phone calls, though. The lack of enthusiasm in his voice was telling. That's sweet, dear, but I wouldn't want to impose. Besides, Janet and I are enjoying our sister time. We're going through old photo albums and reminiscing. The truth was far less sentimental. Each day, I made phone calls from Janet's landline, calls that couldn't be traced back to my cell phone. I spoke with Elaine Winters several more times, consulted with a financial advisor recommended by one of Janet's friends, and most importantly, established a relationship with Steve, the property manager in Stowe. Mrs. Caldwell, Steve had said during our third conversation, confusion evident in his voice. I'm a bit confused. You're saying you're related to the owners of the property? I'm Robert Caldwell's mother, I explained. And technically, I'm a beneficiary of the trust that owns the house. My son manages the trust, but I have certain rights regarding the property. There was a long pause before Steve replied. I see. And does Mr. Caldwell know you're contacting me directly? My son is very busy with his law practice, I said smoothly. He's asked me to look into maximizing the rental potential of the property. Currently, it sits empty most of the time, which seems wasteful, don't you think? Steve couldn't argue with that logic. It's a prime property that could generate significant income if it were available for rent more consistently. Exactly. My thinking, I agreed. I'd like to discuss opening up more of the calendar for rentals. As a beneficiary of the trust, I have an interest in seeing the property generate better returns. By the end of our conversation, Steve had agreed to send me the current rental calendar and rate information. More importantly, he'd promised to keep our discussions confidential for now, until you've had a chance to finalize the new rental strategy with your family. The next phase of my plan required another visit to Stowe. This time, Phil drove me up on a Thursday when Robert and Diane believed I was attending a retired teacher's luncheon in the city. We met with Steve at his office, where I presented the documentation Elaine had prepared for me. This letter from my attorney confirms my status as a beneficiary of the Caldwell Family Trust, I explained, and outlines my right to benefit from trust assets, including rental income from the property. Steve reviewed the document carefully. This seems in order, but I'm still uncomfortable making changes to the rental agreement without direct confirmation from Mr. Caldwell. He's the one who signed our management contract. I'd anticipated this objection. I understand your position, Steve. That's why I'm not asking you to change the contract. I'm simply exercising my right as a beneficiary to access information about the property and to be present during showings to potential renters. This was a critical distinction that Elaine had helped me craft. I wasn't technically changing anything about the management agreement, just asserting my right to be informed and involved. I suppose that would be acceptable, Steve conceded. But I want to be clear that any actual booking changes would need Mr. Caldwell's approval. Of course, I agreed. For now, I'm just gathering information. With that understanding in place, Steve shared the complete rental history of the property. As I suspected, Robert and Diane had blocked off prime weeks for themselves: Christmas, President's Day weekend, several weeks in summer, while renting the house sporadically during other periods. The income generated went directly into the trust account that Robert controlled. What if we opened up some of these blocked dates, I suggested, pointing to weeks that showed no actual occupancy despite being marked as reserved for owners in the system. That would significantly increase the rental income, Steve acknowledged, especially these holiday weeks. They command premium rates. Let's start there, I said decisively. I'll discuss it with my son, but in the meantime, could you put together a projection of potential income if we opened up all dates except when the owners are actually present? By the time Phil and I drove back to Boston that evening, I had everything I needed for the next phase: detailed financial records, a clear understanding of the property's rental potential, and most importantly, Steve's contact information programmed into my phone. The following week, I put on my most convincing performance yet. During Sunday dinner at Robert and Diane's Cambridge home, a meal I'd insisted on attending despite Diane's transparent attempts to discourage me, I played the role of the financially naive mother to perfection. I've been thinking about what you explained about the trust, Robert, I said as Diane served coffee after dinner. It's so complicated, but I'm trying to understand better. Robert exchanged a quick glance with Diane. That's good, Mom. Is there something specific you're confused about? Well, you mentioned that the Vermont property is an investment. I was wondering, does it generate any income? Another glance between them. Some, Robert said cautiously. It gets rented out occasionally, but the primary value is in the appreciation of the property itself. I nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. But wouldn't it generate more income if it was rented more often? I was reading an article about vacation properties, and it said that consistent rentals are key to maximizing returns. Diane set her coffee cup down with a little too much force. We prefer to keep the house available for our own use. The hassle of constant rentals would outweigh any additional income. I see, I murmured, noting how Diane had said we and our, further evidence that they viewed the property as their own rather than a trust asset meant to benefit me. I was just curious. It seems like such a lovely house to sit empty most of the time. How would you know what the house is like? Diane asked sharply. I blinked innocently. From what Robert has described, of course, I'm sure it's beautiful." Emma, who had been quietly coloring at the end of the table, looked up. "You should come visit our Vermont house with us, Grandma. My room has stars on the ceiling that glow in the dark." "That sounds magical, sweetheart," I replied, smiling at my granddaughter while noting the tension in Diane's posture. "Maybe in the spring," Robert interjected quickly. "We should get the place ready first." "Of course," I agreed amiably, "whenever it's convenient." The rest of the evening passed without incident, but I could feel Robert and Diane watching me more carefully, perhaps sensing that I wasn't as oblivious as they'd assumed. It didn't matter. My plan was already in motion, and their suspicions came too late. 3 weeks later, on a crisp March morning, my phone rang. It was Steve from Green Mountain Properties. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, his voice tight with discomfort. "I thought you should know that we've received several booking requests for dates that were previously blocked off as owner reserves. I've tried to contact your son about this, but he hasn't returned my calls." I smiled to myself. This was exactly what I'd been waiting for. "What kind of booking requests, Steve?" "High-value ones. A tech executive wants the house for 2 weeks in July. Weeks that your son and his wife typically use themselves. And there's a film producer interested in the Christmas week. Together, these bookings would generate over $30,000 in rental income." "That's substantial," I observed calmly. "And you say Robert hasn't responded to your inquiries?" "No, ma'am. I've called twice and emailed him the details." "I see. Well, as a beneficiary of the trust, I believe it would be financially irresponsible to turn down such lucrative bookings. Don't you agree?" Steve hesitated. "Mrs. Caldwell, I understand your position, but without explicit approval from the trustee." "The trustee has a fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of the beneficiaries," I interrupted, reciting the language Elaine had coached me on. Declining substantial income without good cause could potentially be seen as a breach of that duty. There was a long silence before Steve responded. "I'll try contacting Mr. Caldwell once more. If I don't hear back within 48 hours, I'll have to make a decision based on the best financial interests of the property." "That seems entirely reasonable," I agreed. I hung up and waited. The confrontation I'd been carefully orchestrating was about to unfold. Sure enough, my phone rang again less than 2 hours later. This time it was Robert, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Mom, have you been talking to the property manager in Vermont?" I took a deep breath, abandoning the pretense of confusion I'd maintained for months. "Yes, Robert, I have." "What the hell do you think you're doing? You have no authority to—" "I have every right," I cut in, my voice calm but firm. "I'm a beneficiary of the trust that owns that property. A trust funded with money that was meant to secure my future, not provide you and Diane with a luxury vacation home." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "How did you," he finally began, "find out the truth? It wasn't difficult once I started looking. Did you really think I would never discover what you'd done? That I would just continue living in my rented apartment, struggling to make ends meet on my teacher's pension, while you enjoyed a second home purchased with my husband's life insurance money?" "Mom, it's not like that. The trust—" "Stop it." "Robert," I said, my voice hardening. "I've seen the documents. I've visited the property. I know exactly what you and Diane did." Another long pause. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from anger to negotiation, the lawyer in him taking over. "We need to discuss this rationally. The property is a good investment. The market in Stowe is strong, and in a few years—" "I don't want to wait a few years," I interrupted. "I'm 68 years old, Robert. The time for me to benefit from Tom's insurance money is now, not in some distant future where you might finally decide I deserve a share of what should have been mine all along." "What exactly do you want?" he asked, his voice tight. "I want?" What's fair? From now on, the rental income from that house goes directly to me. You and Diane can use it for 2 weeks per year. The rest of the time, it gets rented at market rates. And I want a full accounting of the trust assets, overseen by my own financial advisor. That's completely unreasonable. We've put money into renovations, maintenance. Money from the trust, I pointed out, not your personal funds. And those improvements have increased the rental value of the property, which will now benefit me as was always intended. I could almost hear him calculating, weighing his options. I'll need to discuss this with Diane. Of course, I agreed. And I'll need to discuss it with my attorney if we can't reach an agreement. I'm sure the probate court would be very interested in how you've managed the trust assets. The threat hung in the air between us. Robert knew as well as I did that a legal battle would not only be expensive, but potentially damaging to his professional reputation as an attorney. I'll call you tomorrow, he said finally. I'll be waiting, I replied, and ended the call. The next few days were tense. Robert and Diane went silent, presumably consulting with their own legal advisors about their options. I used the time to meet with Elaine again, ensuring that my position was legally sound. They don't have many good choices, Elaine confirmed. Fighting this would expose their mismanagement of the trust. Their best option is to negotiate terms they can live with. When Robert finally called again, his voice was subdued. We need to meet in person to discuss this. I agree, I said, but not at your house or mine, somewhere neutral. We arranged to meet at a quiet cafe in Harvard Square the following afternoon. I arrived early, choosing a table in the corner, where we wouldn't be overheard. When Robert and Diane walked in, I was struck by how different they looked. Both seemed tired, the polished veneer of success slightly tarnished. Thank you for coming, I said, as they took their seats across from me. Diane couldn't quite meet my eyes. Robert cleared his throat. We've considered your proposal. And? I prompted when he hesitated. We're prepared to set up a direct payment of the rental income to you, he said stiffly. But we want to maintain 3 weeks of personal use per year, Christmas and 2 weeks in summer. I considered this. 2 weeks total, your choice of when. And I want backdated rental income for the past 6 months. Diane's head snapped up. That's, fair, I finished for her. Considering that I could demand a full audit of the trust and potentially pursue legal remedies for breach of fiduciary duty. The cafe around us buzzed with afternoon patrons, students with laptops, professors grading papers, tourists resting their feet. None of them aware of the family drama unfolding at our quiet corner table. Robert and Diane exchanged glances, having one of their silent conversations. Finally, Robert nodded. Fine, 2 weeks per year and backdated income for 6 months, but we want your agreement in writing that this resolves all claims regarding the trust. I'll have Elaine draw up the paperwork, I said, naming my attorney deliberately to let them know I wasn't without professional guidance. As we finalized the details, I observed the shift in their demeanor. The mask of superiority Diane had, worn for years, had fallen away, replaced by a thinly disguised resentment. Robert looked tired and defeated, perhaps finally confronting the moral compromise he'd made when he diverted my inheritance for his own benefit. When we rose to leave, Robert hesitated. Mom, I thought I was doing what was best for everyone. I looked at my son, the boy I'd raised, the man who had betrayed my trust, and felt a complex mixture of hurt, disappointment, and residual love. No, Robert. You did what was best for yourself and Diane. Don't pretend otherwise. At least have the courage to own your choices. Diane remained silent, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond my shoulder. What will you tell Emma? Robert asked quietly. Nothing. That would damage her relationship with you, I assured him. Unlike you, I don't believe in using family connections for personal gain. The barb hit home. I could see it in the way he flinched, but I took no pleasure in his discomfort. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice and reclaiming what should have been mine all along. As I watched them walk away, shoulders stiff and steps hurried, I realized that something fundamental had changed between us. The pretense was gone. The polite fiction of a happy family had been replaced by the stark truth of their betrayal and my response to it. The mask hadn't just slipped. It had shattered completely, revealing the raw reality beneath. Whatever our relationship would be going forward, it would at least be honest. And in that honesty, painful as it was, I found a certain peace. Spring bloomed across Boston, bringing with it cherry blossoms along Commonwealth Avenue and a new chapter in my life. The legal agreement with Robert and Diane had been finalized in early April, with Elaine ensuring that every detail protected my interests. The first rental payment, a substantial sum from the backdated income, arrived in my new bank account on April 15th, a date I found ironically appropriate given how tax season reminds us all of financial responsibilities. My first act was to give notice at my rented apartment. After 30 years as a tenant, I was finally ready to become a homeowner again. With Elaine's help, I found a lovely 2-bedroom condominium in a historic brownstone near the public garden. Not lavish, but charming and comfortable, with large windows that filled the rooms with light and a small balcony where I could nurture potted herbs and flowers. "It's perfect," Janet declared when she helped me move in during the first week of May. "Tom would be so pleased to see you, settled in a place of your own." The thought brought tears to my eyes. He would, wouldn't he? This is what he intended all along, for me to be secure and independent. The regular rental income from the Vermont property, combined with my teacher's pension, meant I no longer needed to watch every penny. I could buy fresh flowers for my new dining table, take taxi rides on rainy days instead of struggling with the tea, and occasionally treat myself to dinner at one of the neighborhood restaurants. Small luxuries, perhaps, but ones that represented a profound shift in my circumstances. My relationship with Robert and Diane remained strained, though civility prevailed when necessary. They had lost more than just control of the Vermont property. They had lost the moral high ground and the comfortable fiction that they had been acting in my best interests. Our interactions now had an awkward formality that I suspected would never fully disappear. Emma, however, remained a bright light in my life. Robert brought her to visit my new home without Diane, who always seemed to have convenient conflicts when family gatherings were scheduled. "Your apartment is so pretty, Grandma," Emma exclaimed as she explored every corner of my new space. "And you can walk to the duck pond whenever you want." "That's right," I agreed, smiling at her enthusiasm. "And you can come visit any time and we'll feed the ducks together." As Emma examined the collection of seashells I'd arranged on my windowsill, Robert stood awkwardly in the center of my living room, looking around at the home his father's money had finally provided for me. "It's nice," he said quietly. "I'm glad you found a place you like." The words were benign, but I could hear the complex emotions behind them: guilt, resentment, perhaps a touch of shame. I simply nodded, neither absolving him nor deepening his discomfort. We had reached an understanding of sorts, one built on legal documents rather than trust, but it was an understanding nonetheless. June brought another surprise. Steve from Green Mountain Properties called with news that a prominent novelist wanted to rent the Vermont house for the entire month of July, including the 2 weeks Robert and Diane had reserved for their summer vacation. "It's an exceptional offer," Steve explained, "well above our standard rates. The writer wants a quiet retreat to finish her latest book and is willing to pay a premium for the privacy and short notice." I considered this information carefully. Under our agreement, Robert and Diane were entitled to 2 weeks of personal use per year, and they had already notified Steve of their chosen dates. I could refuse the rental request, forcing Steve to honor their reservation. That would have been my legal right. But something in me resisted the impulse for petty retribution. "Contact Robert," I told Steve. "Explain the situation and the value of this rental. If he and Diane are willing to choose different dates for their vacation, I have no objection." Steve sounded surprised. "You're leaving it up to them?" "Yes," I confirmed. "It should be their choice, but make sure they understand the financial implications." 3 days later, Robert called. "Steve told us about the rental request," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "And?" I prompted. "We'll take our vacation in August instead," he said. "The income difference is substantial." "Thank you," I replied simply. A brief pause followed. "Mom," he began, his tone shifting slightly, "I've been thinking a lot about everything. What happened with the trust, the house, I know it doesn't change anything, but I want you to know that I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air between us, unexpected and yet somehow insufficient. After all the months of deception, the years of watching me struggle financially while they enjoyed weekends at a luxury home purchased with my husband's insurance money, a simple "I'm sorry" seemed inadequate. And yet, it was a beginning. "I appreciate that, Robert," I said finally. "It doesn't erase what happened, but it's something. Would you consider joining us for our August vacation? In Vermont? Emma would love to show you her room with the glow-in-the-dark stars." The invitation surprised me. Part of me wanted to refuse on principle. Why should I visit as a guest in a house that should have been mine? But another part, the part that remembered the little boy who had once been the center of my world, hesitated. "Let me think about it," I said. "I'll let you know." By late summer, my new life had taken on a comfortable rhythm. My condo was fully furnished, with a mix of treasured pieces from my years with Tom and new items that reflected my own taste. I'd joined a book club that met at the local library and reconnected with several former teaching colleagues for monthly lunches. The rental income from Vermont continued to arrive like clockwork, each deposit a quiet vindication of my stand against exploitation. In early August, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called Robert and accepted his invitation to join them in Vermont for a long weekend, not their entire vacation, but a few days to see the property that had become such a significant part of our family story. When I arrived at the house, in Stowe, driven by Janet, who insisted on accompanying me for moral support, I experienced a strange mixture of emotions. The property was undeniably beautiful, perched on its hillside with views of the mountains beyond. But it was also a monument to betrayal and deception, a physical reminder of how thoroughly I had been excluded from decisions about my own inheritance. Diane greeted me with stiff politeness, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Robert seemed nervous, hovering attentively as if unsure of his role. Only Emma behaved normally, grabbing my hand to drag me upstairs to see her room with its constellation of glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. "Daddy put them up for me," she explained, proudly. "They're in the exact same pattern as the real stars outside." I looked around the room, clearly decorated with love and attention to detail, and felt a complicated surge of emotion. This was what Robert and Diane had wanted, a magical retreat, where Emma could create childhood memories. Their methods had been wrong, deeply wrong, but their desire to build something special for their daughter was understandable. That evening, as we sat on the deck watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold, I found myself seated next to Diane while Robert prepared the grill and Emma explored the garden below. "It's a beautiful property," I said after a long silence. Diane nodded, her fingers toying with the stem of her wine glass. "Yes, it is." She hesitated, then added, "I never meant for things To happen this way, Margaret. I raised an eyebrow. Which part? The taking of my inheritance or the getting caught? She flinched slightly, but didn't retreat. Both, I suppose. It started with Robert saying we should manage the money because you weren't financially sophisticated. Then it became about finding a good investment. The house seemed perfect, appreciating value, rental potential. We told ourselves you'd benefit eventually. But in the meantime, you'd enjoy a luxury vacation home while I lived in a one-bedroom. Rental and counted pennies for groceries. Diane had the grace to look ashamed. We were wrong. I was wrong. It wasn't a full apology, but it was more than I had expected from my proud daughter-in-law. I nodded, acknowledging her words without offering easy absolution. The weekend passed in a similar fashion. Moments of genuine connection interspersed with uncomfortable silences and careful navigation around sensitive topics. I saw how Robert and Diane interacted with Emma, their love for their daughter evident in every interaction. I observed the life they had built, the dreams they had pursued, partly at my expense, yes, but not without merits of their own. By Sunday afternoon, when Janet arrived to drive me back to Boston, I had reached a kind of peace with the situation. The Vermont house would never be mine in the way it should have been, but it was now providing me with the security Tom had intended. And perhaps more importantly, I had demonstrated to Robert and Diane, and to myself, that I was not someone who could be easily dismissed or manipulated. The fall brought another change. With my financial situation stabilized, I decided to volunteer at a literacy program for adult learners at the Boston Public Library. 3 mornings a week, I helped people who had fallen through the cracks of the educational system. Immigrants, struggling with English, adults who had never mastered reading skills, older people returning to education after decades away. The work gave me purpose and connected me to a community of people who valued my knowledge and experience. Thanksgiving. Arrived with an invitation from Robert and Diane to join them in Cambridge. I accepted, bringing a cranberry pie made from Tom's recipe and a determination to focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on past grievances. The dinner was not without tension, but there were moments of genuine warmth as well. Emma proudly showed me a school project about family histories, where she had included photos of Tom and stories I had told her about his childhood in Western Massachusetts. Diane made an effort to engage me in conversation about my volunteer work, showing more interest than she had in years. Robert seemed more relaxed than he had been since our confrontation, though a new humility tempered his usual confidence. As we finished dessert, Robert cleared his throat. Mom, Diane and I have been discussing something we'd like to propose. He glanced at his wife, who nodded encouragingly. We've decided to transfer ownership of the Vermont property entirely to the trust, with you as the primary beneficiary and trustee. I set down my coffee cup, surprised. What does that mean exactly? It means you'll have full control, he explained. You'll decide when it gets rented, when family can use it, how the income is distributed. We'd still like to use it occasionally, but those terms would be up to you. I studied their faces, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agendas. What I saw instead was something unexpected, a genuine attempt at atonement. Why now? I asked. Diane spoke up. Because it's the right thing to do. It should have been yours from the beginning. She hesitated, then added, and because we want Emma to grow up seeing that when you make a mistake, you try to make it right. I considered their offer carefully. Having complete control of the property would secure my financial future even more firmly. It would also represent a kind of justice, a restoration of what should have been mine all along. I'll think about it, I said finally, and I'll discuss it with my attorney. Robert nodded, accepting my caution as understandable. 2 weeks. Later, after thorough consultation with Elaine, I agreed to the transfer with one significant modification. The trust would now benefit not only me, but also establish a college fund for Emma. It seemed fitting that Tom's legacy should extend to his granddaughter's education, creating something positive from the painful episode that had divided our family. As winter settled over Boston once again, I found myself reflecting on the journey of the past year. What had begun with an innocent question at a Christmas dinner had evolved into a profound transformation of my life. I had moved from powerlessness to agency, from financial insecurity to stability, from silent acceptance to principled action. The relationship with my son and his wife would never be what it once was. Too much had been revealed about their character and priorities for that. But we had found a new equilibrium, one based on clearer boundaries and mutual respect rather than exploitation. One snowy evening in mid-December, as I sat by the window of my condo watching the flakes dance, in the glow of the street lamps, my phone rang. It was Steve from Green Mountain Properties. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said warmly, "I wanted to let you know that we've just received a booking request for the house, a family of 4 who want to spend Christmas week there. Since you're now managing the reservation calendar, I wanted to check with you directly." I smiled, appreciating the small but significant pleasure of being the decision-maker. "Thank you, Steve. Please go ahead and confirm the booking." "And what about your family?" he asked. "Will you be using the house at all this winter?" I thought about Robert and Diane, about Emma and her room with the stars on the ceiling. I thought about Tom and what he would have wanted for all of us. Not this winter, I decided, but perhaps in the spring. I hear Vermont is beautiful when the snow melts and everything turns green again. After ending the call, I returned to the window, watching the snow transform the city into something magical and new. My revenge, if that's what it could be called, hadn't been loud or dramatic. It had been quiet and methodical, driven not by a desire to hurt, but by a determination to restore what should have been mine. In the end, I had gained far more than financial security. I had reclaimed my dignity, my independence, and my voice. I had shown Robert and Diane, and perhaps, more importantly myself, that age hadn't diminished my resolve or intelligence. The quiet victory of standing up for myself had transformed me in ways I was still discovering. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the city in a blanket of pristine white. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. But tonight, in the warm comfort of my own home, secured by my own efforts, I allowed myself to simply enjoy the peace that comes from knowing that justice, however delayed, had finally been served.